In this tutorial, we will create timers in pygame. Now, the actual project that we are going to make is not going to look terribly interesting. But that's okay, because what really matters is that we are going to create a timer class that is really easy to use. As a matter of fact, let's talk about what I want to achieve. I want to create a timer that is really easy to use. On top of that, the timer should run once or multiple times, depending on what you specify. The timer should also be able to run a function on timeout, and we should be able to update the duration in real time. Once you have all of those functionalities, you can create timers on your own, which is really important because Pygame's inbuilt timers just aren't very good. And if you want to create more complex projects, having reliable timers is incredibly useful. Now, for all of that, let's have a quick look at Pygame. I already have some basic code. If I run all of this, we can see that we have a plain black window. To go over it super quick, we are importing Pygame and the exit method to close the game later on. Then we are initializing Pygame, we are creating a display surface, and after that, we're creating a clock and a font. Next up, we are creating a while loop. In there, we are capturing delta time, although for this tutorial, we are not going to use it, but I think it should generally be there. Next up, we are running the for loop to check if the player wants to close the game, after which we are closing the game. Finally, we are updating the frame so we can actually see what's going on. Although that at the moment doesn't do anything because there's nothing to draw. But that's going to come very soon. First of all, I want to talk about inbuilt timers in Pygame. And there isn't really that much. Basically, the only thing that you can really do is you first of all create a timer event, which you get via pygame.event.custom_type. After you have that, you can run pygame.time.set_timer. Then specify the event, in my case timer event, and the duration, let's say 500 milliseconds or half a second. After you have that, inside your event loop, you are going to get this event every 500 millisecond or whatever you have specified. Which means you can simply check if event.type is equal to the timer event. If that is the case, let's print inbuilt timer. If I now run the code, we're getting inbuilt timer every 500 milliseconds. And just to make sure this is working, let me change the number to 2000. Now we should be getting a lot less output. And we are still getting it every 2 seconds. So I think that looks good. And that's basically the main thing you could be doing with the inbuilt timers in Pygame. Unfortunately, these inbuilt timers just aren't terribly useful, for a couple of reasons actually. For example, once you have created this timer, you cannot update the duration anymore, which sometimes can be quite important. Also, quite often, you only want to run a timer once, not continuously, which with these inbuilt timers, you cannot influence. Hence, it makes a ton of sense to create your own timer class that overcomes all of these limitations. Although, to make that work, we have to cover how timers work in general. The basic idea of a timer is, imagine you have the timeline of your game, meaning all the way on the left, we have the starting point. This would be in milliseconds, the point 0. And then at some point, the game ends. This point doesn't really matter. It could theoretically be infinite. Now, to create your own custom timer, you first of all want to measure one point in time, and this would be your start point. After that, you want to continuously measure the time. So, for example, if I put real numbers on this thing, our start point for the timer could be 500 or half a second. And after that, you keep on checking the time. This could be 501, then a bit later we can get 520, and so on. We keep on measuring the time going forward. With that system alone, we already know the difference between the starting time and the current time. For example, the distance between this 500 and this 520 is 20 milliseconds. That is the amount of time that has passed since we started our timer. This can be even more useful because ultimately all that we really want to do is to have some kind of duration. Let's say in our case the duration could be 800 milliseconds. After which, we want to time out the timer, which in practice really just means that we want to check the distance between the starting point and the current time. If this duration is greater than 800, we know we have exceeded the duration, which means we want to time out the timer and then do something. What that specific thing is going to be is entirely up to you. Let's do a simple demonstration of that inside of pygame. And while we are doing this, I want to comment out the inbuilt timers because they might become confusing. First of all, we want to set a start time, and this for now can simply be 0. After that, we want to have our current time. And when we are starting, this value should also be 0. However, when we are running the game inside of the while loop, this current time I do have to update to, well, get the current time. That we can do via I want to get the current time and then pygame.time.get_ticks. GetTicks is an inbuilt method in pygame and it gives you the amount of time since the game has started. Or to be a bit more specific, the time since we have called pygame.init. Also, this one works in milliseconds. Basically, when we are working with timers, we always work in milliseconds. Can be sometimes a bit deceptive. But anyway, finally, we want to have a duration, which can be basically whatever you want. Let's say 800 to stick with the same example. All we have to do now is compare these values. So if current time minus the start time is greater or equal to the duration, then we want to print time out. Let's try this one now. And after 800 milliseconds, we are getting timeout. If we increase the duration to something like 2000, then after 2 seconds, we should be getting timeout. And that works perfectly well. So that would be the basic logic on how to create your own timers. Unfortunately, this kind of logic isn't particularly usable. Imagine you had 20 timers. Doing this kind of comparison every single time would just be a nightmare. As a matter of fact, I want to get rid of all of this because this is not how we are going to create a timer. Instead, we are going to create a timer class that will cover all of this functionality for us. For that, I want to create a new Python file and name it timer.py. First of all, we want from pygame.time import get_ticks. The same method to get the time since the start that we have just used, and you do not want to call this one. After that, I want to create a class called timer. No need for inheritance on this one. In there, we will need a dunder init method, where for now we have self and a duration. That duration, by the way, we also want to store as an attribute right away. On top of that, we want to create 2 more attributes. Self.startTime, which by default can be 0, and finally self.active, which by default should be false. After that, we want to create an update method for this timer. In there, we first of all want to check if the timer is active in the first place. So if self.active, and then we want to do something. Most importantly, we want to get the current time, which we're getting with getTicks. After that, we want to check if the current time minus self.startTime is greater or equal than self.duration. If that is the case, we want to deactivate this timer, which we can do via another method, self.deactivate. This method does not exist right now. Let's create it really quick. Define deactivate. All that's going to happen in there is self.active will be false, and self.startTime we can set back to 0. Also, at the moment, we can only deactivate the timer, but we are never able to activate it in the first place. For that, I want to create an activate method as well. All that one's going to do is set self.active to true, and self.startTime is going to be getTicks. And with that, we have a timer. The way it's going to work, just to reiterate, when we are activating the timer, we are setting a start time, meaning if this is the duration of the game, with the start point being here. When we are starting the timer, we are capturing 1 point in time. Let's say this is 500. After that, we want to run the update method continuously, meaning this one will check the time continuously after this point. That is what we are doing with the current time. After that, we are checking if this current time minus self.startTime is greater than the duration. The duration could be, I don't know, 1000. If our current time is exceeding that point, meaning we are here, then we want to deactivate the timer, which means we are setting active to false and start time to 0. So none of this is going to run anymore. After that, inside of main.py, to use it, first of all, we have to import it from timer import timer. And to create a really simple example, let's create a simple timer, which will be a timer with a duration of 1 second or 1000 milliseconds. This timer we also want to activate right away. So simple timer.activate. With that, after we are creating the timer, we are setting the start time right away, and we are setting active to true, which means we want to do all of this. Although for that to work, we have to call the update method, meaning inside of main.py, we want to call the simple timer with update. After we have that, let's for now simply print simple timer and then check if this timer is active or not. It should only be active for the first second of the game. After that, it should not be active anymore. And now we get true and then false after 1 second. Now to make all of this a bit more visual, let me use an if statement. I want to check if this timer is active. If that is the case, I want to create a text surface, which I can get with font.render. I want to display that 1 second has passed. The anti-alias should be false, and the text color should be white. After that, I want to get the display surface and split what we have just created. So the text surface at position 0 and 0. If I am now running all of this, we get 1 second has passed immediately. There are 2 mistakes here actually. Number 1 is when we are running the game, we are never filling the background with a color. That we can fix quite easily. I, before this if statement, want to run the display surface and fill it with a black color. And now we are doing this again. We can see 1 second has passed, but only for the first second. Remember, this timer, since we're activating it right away, will be active for 1 second, which is what we are checking inside of this if statement. But after 1 second, it will not be active anymore, meaning this text will only be displayed for the first second of the game. But we want to do the exact opposite. We want to check if this timer is not active. Now if I run this again, after 1 second, we're getting 1 second has passed. And this is going to stay there forever. So this would be a really basic timer that is going to trigger right away and then disables after 1 second. At the moment, this is only going to run once, but we can update that as well. For example, what we could be doing is set another parameter, let's call it repeat, which by default is going to be false. That parameter we want to store right away. Self.repeat should get the repeat value. After we have that, inside of deactivate, I want to check if self.repeat, and if that is the case, after we are deactivating the timer, I want to self.activate the same timer right away. That way, it keeps on running forever. Also, what we can do while we are here, I want to also set an auto start parameter, which once again should be false by default. The way we are going to use that one is if auto start, then we want to activate the timer right away. And that's about it. We don't actually have to store this auto start as an attribute. Righty, with that, back inside of main.py, there are 2 things we want to test, repeat and auto start. Let's start with auto start because that way we can get rid of this one line. Instead of activating the timer right after creating it, I want to simply set auto start to true. And now if I run all of this, we are still getting the same result while writing less code, which is always a good sign. After that, let's test the repeat parameter. I want to set this one to true. If I now run this, we are not going to see the text ever. And that should actually make sense. When you think about it, after we are creating the timer, we are starting it right away. So simple timer.active is going to be true. But then after 1 second, when we are getting to deactivate, we are setting active to false, but then running the activate method, which is going to set active straight back to true. Because of that, this simple timer.active is never going to be false, and as a consequence, this text will never be shown, which is a bit of a limitation. And the best way to get around that is to add one more parameter. And that is, after this timer times out, we want to run a function. One that we are going to pass into this class when we are creating it. Although by default, the value for this function should be none. This function we have to store with self.func is going to be the function. After that, once the timer is running out and we are deactivating it, we want to do something else before. If self.func exists, then we want to call it, meaning self.func, and now we can actually add the parentheses. With that, we are running a function once the timer times out. After that, back inside of main.py, first of all, I want to get rid of the repeat parameter from our simple timer. That way, we should be able to see the text again after 1 second, and that looks good. Next up, I want to create a repeat timer, which once again is going to be a timer. The duration will be 1500. Auto start should be true, repeat should also be true, and finally, we have to specify a function, which in my case, I will call toggle var. That function doesn't exist right now, so let's create it. Toggle var. All I really want to do in there is I want to create some kind of variable. Let's call it show text, which by default is going to be false. Then inside of toggle var, I want to turn this into a global variable, so show text. That way we can influence this value from inside of the function. And all we really want to do is show text should get the value of not show text. That way, every time we are running this function, we are setting show text either to true or false. It's starting with false, but after this function, this one will be true until we run the function again, after which it will be false again. And that function will run with the timer every 1.5 seconds. After that, in the game loop, first of all, on the repeat timer, we have to call the update method. After that, for now, let's simply print show text. Now let's run this, and we are starting with false, but then we get true, then we get false again, we go back to true, then false, and so on. This keeps on working forever, so that's looking really good. And that kind of thing we could, for example, use inside of an if statement. So if show text, I want to create a text surface, which I can do in the same way I've done before, except now I want to display timer is on. After that, I want to create a text rectangle, which is going to be text surface with get f rectangle. I want to place the top left at the position 0 and 300. I want to display surface.split the text surface in the text rectangle. And now if I fix my typo, this should be top left and run all of this. We can see timer is on, and this one goes on and off. Like that. That looks really good. Also, what we could be doing is pygame.draw.rect on the display surface with a green color in the position of the text rectangle. Now let's try this again, and now we have a green background. But the functionality is still working just as before. Also, after that, we can add an else statement and then do the very same logic, except now the timer is off. For the position, we can go with 200, and for the background color, we can go with red. After that, we can see timer is off, timer is on, timer is off, and this keeps on going. Perfect. So with that, we have a timer that's very easy to use, that can be used either repeatedly or once, and that you can then work with quite easily. Also, to make your life a bit easier, I usually store all of the timers inside of a dictionary. Let's call it timers, and in there we have a dictionary with key value pairs. We have a simple timer, that's the timer we have just created, and we have a repeat timer. That's the timer we created after that. Once we have that, we don't have to call each update method individually anymore. Instead, we can simply go for timer in timers.values. That way, we're getting all of the timers inside of the dictionary. And then call timer.update. After that, we also have to update this simple timer.active. This should now be the timers with simple. We can run all of this again, and it's going to work just as before. That looks really good. Finally, what we are also able to do now is inside of the event loop, we could check if event.type is equal to pygame.keyDown. So we are checking for any kind of key press, and then we want to check if event.key is equal to pygame.k_down. That's the down arrow on the keyboard. If that is the case, we want to reduce the duration of the repeat timer. That way it's going to run faster. To get that, all we need is the timers, then the repeat method, and update the duration. Let's say we want to reduce it by 100 milliseconds. And just to make sure this is working, I also want to print the duration of the timer. So print duration. And then if I now run all of this and I press down, we get a much faster timer. And there we go. This is looking pretty good. Now for this part, you do have to be careful that you do not go negative. If you're doing that, you're going to get some funky behavior. On top of that, to make this thing a bit more usable, we can check for another input, which would be k up. If that is the case, we want to increase the duration by 100 milliseconds. And now, if I run this again, I can reduce the duration of the timer or make it much, much slower. But other than that, it's still going to work just fine. And with that, we have a custom timer that is significantly more powerful than the inbuilt pygame ones, which for more complex games is incredibly useful. So I hope this video was useful, and I'll see you around.